Have you ever stopped to think about how a country actually gets started? I mean, after the American Revolution, the founders had to build a nation from the ground up, and, well, they didn't agree on much. This led to one of the most important debates in U.S. history, a clash of ideas that, believe it or not, still shapes our world today: the Federalists versus the Anti-Federalists.
Okay, just imagine for a second. You've just won a war against a powerful king. You're free. But now, what? Now you've got the really hard job. How do you build a country from scratch? How do you set up a government that's strong, but also fair? One that won't turn into the exact same kind of monster you just fought to escape. This was the massive question facing America's founders.
So, their first attempt at a government, under a rule book called the Articles of Confederation, was, not great. It was basically a disaster. The national government was so weak it couldn't even collect taxes to pay its bills. States were starting to argue and act like they were separate countries. The whole American experiment was about to go down the drain.
Yeah, things were getting really serious. With a weak government and chaos brewing, the nation was teetering on the brink of collapse. America's leaders knew they had to come up with a new plan, and they had to do it fast, before the freedom they just won slipped right through their fingers.
This led to a huge meeting in 1787, where leaders from the states decided to scrap the old plan and write a brand new one. This new rulebook was called the Constitution. You can think of it as the ultimate instruction manual for how the U.S. government is supposed to work, what it can do, and just as importantly, what it can't do.
But the moment they showed this new Constitution to the public, the country basically split into two teams. And these teams had completely different ideas about what America's future should look like.
On one side, you had the Federalists. Their big idea? America needed a strong, powerful central government to hold everyone together and protect the nation. But on the other side, you had the Anti-Federalists. They were super suspicious of a big government far away from home. They thought the real power should stay with the individual states, closer to the people.
So who are the big names on these teams? Well, leading the Federalists, you had guys like Alexander Hamilton and James Madison. And for the Anti-Federalists, you had some serious heavyweights too, like George Mason and Patrick Henry, yep, the guy famous for shouting, "Give me liberty or give me death."
And their supporters were totally different too. The Federalists tended to be merchants, bankers, and people living in the big cities, folks who thought a strong national economy was key. The Anti-Federalists, on the other hand, were mostly small farmers and people from rural areas who really valued their independence and were worried a powerful government would just forget about them.
So let's really get into what they were arguing about. This wasn't some minor disagreement. They were debating the huge, fundamental questions about what it means to be free and how to run a country. First up, a really basic question. How big should a country be to stay free? The Anti-Federalists were convinced that liberty could only work in small communities, where you basically knew your leaders. But the Federalists, especially James Madison, came up with this pretty radical new idea. He argued that a huge country was actually safer, because with so many different groups competing for power, no single one could ever become strong enough to take over.
And then there was the president. The Federalists said, look, we need one strong leader, an executive, who can make decisions and get things done. But the Anti-Federalists were absolutely terrified of this. To them, a powerful president with control of the army sounded, well, a lot like a king, the very thing they just fought a war to get rid of.
Of course, it all comes down to money, right? The Federalists insisted that the new national government had to have the power to tax people directly. I mean, how else was it going to pay its debts from the war and command respect? But the Anti-Federalists saw this as a nightmare, predicting that a powerful national tax would just drain money from the states and crush regular people.
Now, of all these arguments, one issue became the absolute biggest sticking point. It was a problem that almost derailed the entire Constitution, and it was only solved by a really clever compromise we now call the Bill of Rights bargain.
So the Anti-Federalists read through the proposed Constitution, and they noticed something huge was missing. There was no Bill of Rights. You know, a clear, written-out list of freedoms that the government is simply not allowed to touch, like your freedom of speech or freedom of religion.
For the Anti-Federalists, this was a massive red flag. They thought, are you kidding me? You build this powerful new government, and you don't even list out the rights it can't take away? They saw it as a dangerous flaw that could easily lead to the government abusing its power.
So here's how the deal went down. The Anti-Federalists dug in their heels and said, no Bill of Rights, no Constitution. At first, the Federalists pushed back, saying it wasn't necessary. But they needed to get the Constitution approved, so they made a critical promise. Okay, look,
ratify the Constitution as is, and we promise the very first thing we do will be to add a Bill of Rights. That promise was the key.
Now, for the Constitution to become the law of the land, they didn't need all 13 states to agree, but they did need a supermajority. They needed at least 9 of the 13 states to ratify or approve it. And thanks to that promise to add a Bill of Rights, they finally hit that magic number. The Constitution was in.
So you might think the Federalists won. End of story. But not so fast. The ideas of the Anti-Federalists didn't just vanish. In fact, you could say their debate never really ended at all.
Just think about it. The Bill of Rights, which was the Anti-Federalists' biggest demand, is now one of the most celebrated parts of the entire Constitution. And that core argument, how much power should the national government have versus the states, that is a debate that is still happening right now every single day in American politics.
And the ideas from this time were so powerful, we still study them closely. To convince people to support the Constitution, the Federalists wrote a series of 85 brilliant essays called the Federalist Papers. To this day, judges, lawyers, and historians read those essays to get a better handle on what the founders were actually trying to do.
Ultimately, this whole epic debate boils down to one timeless question that every single generation has to answer for itself. Where do you draw that line? How do you create a government that's strong enough to protect you, but not so powerful that it takes away your freedom? The Federalists and Anti-Federalists started that conversation over 200 years ago, and it's a conversation that we're all still a part of today.